not just the heat, but which is a big factor, which is driving some of the regions where coffee is produced uphill. We're also seeing extra diseases increasing and being able to go up into those upslope areas. It's also impacting productivity because the higher temperatures are affecting both the physical and mental health of those that are working on the coffee plantations. It is happening now. I guess that's the thrust here of this report, is to highlight that this situation can only get worse unless we take more action now.
How will the impact of climate change on those coffee-producing countries impact on we, the consumers?
For Australians wanting to drink their coffee, it's going to choke up supply lines. We could see higher price as well as challenges of getting the coffee itself. But flavour and quality is likely to be impacted as well. So price and quality are likely to pay the price of inaction on climate change.
US top climate negotiator Brian Deese and China's Vice Premier Zhang Gaoli meeting ahead of US President Obama's visit to Beijing on his way to the G20 summit. Both nations aim to implement the Paris Climate Accord as soon as possible and tackle emissions from air travel and other sources too. It was Vice Premier Zhang who signed the Paris Climate Accord for China at the United Nations back in April. But the world may not have gotten there had China and the US not joined forces back in November 2014. At a groundbreaking meeting in Beijing, both President Xi and Obama agreed on a joint approach to curbing climate change, and both countries made ambitious pledges. It read, "The United States intends to achieve an economy-wide target of reducing its emissions by 26% to 28% below its 2005 level in 2025, and to make the best efforts to reduce its emissions by 28%. China intends to achieve the peaking of CO2 emissions around 2030 and to make its best efforts to peak early, and intends to increase the share of non-fossil fuels in primary energy consumption to around 20% by 2030. That momentum helped secure the Paris climate deal last year. The two leading greenhouse gas emitters have since signed the agreement and are set to announce implementation. World leaders travelling to Hangzhou are seeing a global push on the issue driven by Beijing and Washington.
Where the greatest emissions are coming from are the three largest emitters, the United States, the European Union, and China. I am extremely encouraged by what those three areas, the European Union has been a leader for years. China's making very bold moves to reduce their carbon emission. And the United States, the President Obama has taken very bold leadership here in this country as well.
For China, the G20 meeting comes as the country is set to roll out an ambitious carbon trading system which aims to apply market forces to cutting emissions. A big push towards clean coal and renewables means China may actually beat its targets. The US too is pushing many initiatives, but has political challenges from politicians who do not recognise the climate change threat. Evidence of that change can be seen everywhere, from the coral in Australia's Great Barrier Reef to the melting Arctic, and perhaps the recent flooding in the US state of Louisiana. And here in Washington, D.C., the temperatures this summer have been breaking records, and that's true globally. 2016 could be another hottest year on record. A reminder that even though the two biggest emitters are the most committed to tackling climate change, it's still a race against time. Nathan King, CCTV, Washington.
The world's two biggest polluters, China and the US, have both ratified the Paris Climate Change Agreement. President Xi Jinping and Barack Obama announced the move on Saturday ahead of a G20 summit in the city of Hangzhou. The ratification is seen as a key step in efforts to bring the deal into force by the end of the year.
Just as I believe the Paris Agreement will ultimately prove to be a turning point for our planet, I believe that history will judge today's efforts as pivotal. As the world's two largest economies and two largest emitters, our entrance into this agreement continues the momentum of Paris and should give the rest of the world confidence, whether developed or developing countries, that a low-carbon future is where the world is heading.
China and the US together total around 40% of the world's carbon emissions. The Paris Agreement seeks to stop average temperatures rising above 2 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels. To take effect, it needs the participation of 55 countries, representing 55% of global emissions.
Humans have changed the Earth so much that some scientists say we have entered a brand new geological age. According to a report in the Science magazine, the Earth is now in the Anthropocene epoch. Millions of years from now, our impact on Earth will be found in rocks and sediment. Just like we see fossils of plants and animals which lived years ago. Except this time, scientists of the future will find radioactive elements from nuclear bombs and fossilized plastic. Joining me tonight to break all of this down is our conservation biologist expert, Dr. Reese Halter. These are big words, Reese. Good to have you with us tonight. This new age, tell us about it.
Yeah, Ed, there's three things that come to mind. First of all, imagine you're back on the football field. Each year in America alone, we throw away the equivalent of one football field 100 miles deep. That's the first thing. The second thing is we've entered the age of climate instability. That means from burning subsidized climate-altering fossil fuels, our food security is in jeopardy. The third thing that's striking, Ed, is we're losing species 1,000 times faster than the last 65 million years. At this rate, within 33 years, by mid-century, that means 800,000 forms of life, or half of everything we know, will be gone. The only way we can reverse this is to two things. Save nature now, our life support system, and we do this by switching to 80% renewables by 2030. It's a World War III mentality. In America, we have the technology, we have the blueprint, we lack the political will just right now, but in the next short while, we will, because it's a matter of survival. Ed?
So we've just gone through the hottest month on record. There's plenty of data out there to suggest that we truly are entering something, our world has never seen in our lifetime. To brand it as a new geological age, what impact is that going to have?
Well, it's got the impact that humans are here. And as I said earlier, we're taking 160% more than Mother Earth can sustain 7.4 billion people. The way to do it is to pull it back to 90%. If you look at, if we were a big bathtub, the ring will read toxicity, toxicity, toxicity. We've got to peel that back, because what we do to the Earth, Ed, we do to ourselves.
Winemakers in France have been hit by drought, hail and a spring frost that's seen production plunge by at least 10%. In the Champagne region, yields have dropped by 32% for the year. One winemaker says he's lost about 65% of his normal yield. This cognac wine producer says, as you can see, it's completely dry, even deep down. You see here that the direct consequences on the wine grapes, burnt by the heat. Some winemakers lost their entire crop just before the 2016 harvest was set to start. Inclement weather has caused problems for many French regions this year. The Bourgogne and Loire areas were amongst the worst affected.
Deep in southern Louisiana, the nation's first officially recognized climate change refugees.
We are the face of climate change. We bring reality to climate change by us having to make decisions between, do we stay, do we go, do we risk our health, do we risk losing this peace that we have here.
On a small, narrow strip of disappearing land, residents of Ile de Jean-Charles are floundering on their own island. Residents on the island, most of whom belong to a Native American tribe, have been offered millions in federal funding to resettle somewhere else as rising sea levels slowly swallow what's left of their home. Climate change, adding to the island's natural sinking process, has already been accelerated by oil and gas extraction in the region. Residents are now left grappling with the reality of parting ways with their community.
Something in me will stay behind because this is where it started. This is where I was raised. This is where home was. This is where I belong.
I've been living here all my life and till I die.
Even if it floods over and over again?
We clean it out.
But soon, residents may not have a choice whether to stay or go. Experts warn living on the island will become virtually impossible as changes to the landscape become irreversible.
To me, it's just another symptom of the human footprint on the earth. There are so many things that we do. We overpollute, we burn too much fossil fuel, and all of this is coming back to try to help us learn that we shouldn't have done some of these things in the past.
The island, once a place to call home, is now a real-time lesson of the impacts of climate change. Emily Roseman, Associated Press.
Hawaii is bracing itself for the arrival of Hurricane Madeline, which is sweeping across the Pacific towards the island chain. The sheer size of the weather system has been captured on cameras from the International Space Station. With winds expected up to 193 kilometres per hour, the authorities are urging residents to prepare by stocking up on food and emergency supplies. And this is what strong winds can do when seen back on Earth. Typhoon Lion Rock made landfall on Japan's northeast coast on Tuesday, bringing heavy rains along with wind speeds of more than 120 kilometres per hour. Police have reported at least 10 deaths, 9 of them in a flooded care home for the elderly. The Category 1 typhoon dumped about 35 centimetres of rain, more than the average rainfall for the whole of August.
Towns across northern Japan are underwater from a typhoon strike tonight. At least 11 people died, most of them residents at a nursing home. Aerials today showed the damaged buildings on the banks of a swollen river. Elsewhere, rescue workers pulled stranded victims from rooftops. Meanwhile, Hawaii's Big Island is bracing for a hurricane overnight, and a tropical storm is brewing in the Gulf of Mexico.
A powerful typhoon has struck Japan's northeastern prefecture of Iwate, leaving at least 11 people dead. Most of the victims are elderly people who died at a nursing home. Typhoon Lion Rock has triggered heavy flooding in the region and caused widespread power outages.
It's been a wet winter, but the first day of spring has come with a serious bushfire warning. A new report shows a dry spring and hot summer will make conditions extra dangerous, and those who live in high-risk areas need to act now.
You don't have to look far for the tragic reminders of WA's fire season. Yarloop has only just reopened after a monster blaze tore through the town 9 months ago. 2 men died, 128 homes destroyed, while in Esperance, 4 people perished. This summer will be just as bad. Very little rain is expected in spring. Fuel loads are dry and high. A new report by leading bushfire researchers has highlighted Perth and the southwest as one of the most dangerous fire zones in the country.
It was a tragic year last year, and we don't want that to continue. We want people to be ready.
The report says our soil is dangerously dry. Prescribed burns have reduced some of the fuel load, but the real danger lies in our state forests. Heavy rainfall last autumn restricted controlled burn-offs in the forests, leaving higher fuel loads. Authorities are still waiting for conditions to become more favourable so they can burn off 200,000 hectares of land. They can only do so much to save homes and lives. Firefighters say too many people living in the danger zones are complacent, thinking it won't happen to them.
We're asking people to prepare their house, make sure if they've got evaporative air conditioners that they can put mesh across them to prevent ember attack. We're also asking them to clear flammable material from around their house.
Michael Genovese, 9 News.
The Indian government has deployed rescue teams to the country's northeastern states where heavy monsoon rains have caused a humanitarian crisis. The flooding has forced over 200,000 people into relief camps. The devastating floods have also claimed the lives of over 300 people.
Three separate wildfires that may have been started deliberately have been raging along Spain's Costa Blanca since Sunday. The fires have been aggravated by soaring 42-degree temperatures and strong winds. Buildings in the town of Jabia and large areas of vegetation near the holiday destination of Benidorm were destroyed. Authorities almost had the first fire under control when the others began. We've been fighting this since 5 p.m, which is when the fire started. And when we thought that the fire was almost under control, the air support withdrew and we started to pack up. But then there was another flare-up. It's a pity because the original fire has now extended to where this flare-up is now. Though there are no reports of any serious injuries at the moment, 1,000 residents and tourists have been forced to flee, with 300 staying in emergency shelters. We haven't had serious health emergencies. We had to evacuate people who were walking on the street with their suitcases and fleeing from the wildfire. We've evacuated a lot of people and are still doing so, but as far as health-related emergencies go, we have only had 1 case of smoke inhalation requiring hospital attention and little else. The head of Valencia's emergency services, Jose Maria Angel, said that the fires were set deliberately on the hottest day of the year.
Take a holiday, they said. Come to Jabia, it's a lovely place. There's a fire right now, right behind my apartment, which is there. From what I can see, it's where my car's parked, so that's good.
California firefighters have a new fire to battle with in the parched region. The so-called Havilah fire expanded to around 130 acres in just a few hours. The blaze was spreading quickly. This prompted officials to divert resources from another fire in order to help. Planes can be seen dropping fire retardant onto the flames to try and keep them at bay. There have been no reports of injuries, but Kern County fire crews are preparing themselves for at least 200 evacuations. It's reported that an evacuation centre has been set up in a nearby church.
We're bringing everything out on this. You see, we've got agencies from all around Southern California here, as well as all the air support and dozers that have been coming in. So we want to keep it small as we possibly can, and we just don't need this getting up into the forest.
Are you guys able to make it work for the night if they stay where they're at? Yeah, we can make it work.
North Carolina caught a break today when a tropical system that threatened the Outer Banks moved out to sea. But Tropical Storm Hermine formed in the Gulf of Mexico and could become the first hurricane to hit Florida's mainland since Wilma nearly 11 years ago. 4 million people are in its path, and here's Omar Villafranca.
Pounding surf and gusting winds were the first signs of Tropical Storm Hermine's arrival on Florida's west coast today. In the coastal town of Gulfport, the storm's first rain band submerged neighborhood streets in almost a foot of water. The water quickly surrounded this home, turning the front yard into a pond.
I'm pretty worried.
Debbie Dede is already fighting ankle-deep water in her mother's home.
The water has been really bad. We actually have a pump inside ready to go to flow out the water out here.
The storm is expected to make landfall tomorrow, soaking portions of the Florida coast with as much as 15 inches of rain. Hermine has not reached hurricane strength, but Governor Rick Scott is still warning Floridians about the dangerous storm.
We're going to see some water, don't drive into it. We're going to see down power lines, be careful, don't drive around them.
Wolfgang Deiniger and Karen Love walked around their Gulfport neighborhood to check out the early flooding. The two residents say they've already made preparations for the storm.
Sandbags. I've got sandbags in the back of my Jeep. We're driving around, seeing if anybody needs any.
There are still some people out here enjoying the beach, but they're going to have to be careful with the dangerous riptide. Nora, area schools are canceled tomorrow in anticipation of the storm.
All right, Omar, thank you so much.
Let's go to Omar Villafranca in Panacea, Florida. He's near where the storm came ashore. Omar, good morning.
Good morning. Hermine made landfall about 15 miles from here, and the storm left its mark. Thousands of trees like this one were toppled over. This one just happens to be about 50 feet tall. It's now blocking this road. Thousands of people are still without power, and that storm surge flooded entire communities. Overnight, Hermine smashed into Florida's Gulf Coast, making landfall as a Category 1 hurricane around 1:30 a.m. Eastern Time, dumping torrential rain
and unleashing powerful winds of 80 miles per hour. The first hurricane to hit the state of Florida in more than a decade has already knocked out power to tens of thousands of people. Roads in Alligator Harbor have been torn apart. Massive storm surges, some projected to be up to 12 feet high, are pummeling coastal areas. Evacuations are underway in areas north of Tampa, where water has jumped over seawalls and started to push into homes.
I don't know the condition of my house. I don't know if it's flooded or if it isn't. It's really, really, really bad. Like, I've never seen it this bad before.
As Hermine churns northward,
the street is completely underwater.
It's soaking parts of Florida that have already seen close to 2 feet of rain over the last 3 days. Governor Rick Scott has declared a state of emergency in 51 counties with 6,000 National Guardsmen on standby. He's urging everyone not to take any chances with this storm.
We can rebuild a home, we can rebuild a business, we cannot rebuild your life.
The storm has lost some of its destructive power as it heads north into Georgia. No word yet on if this storm has killed anyone. Nora?
That is some good news. Omar, thank you so much.
Well, tonight, the mid-Atlantic is getting hammered by Hermine. The storm is rumbling up the coast, washing out holiday weekend plans from the Carolinas to New England. It's unleashing heavy rain, damaging winds, and dangerous seas. A second person was killed by the storm in North Carolina on Saturday. Mark Strassman is in Wilmington, North Carolina.
Tropical storm Hermine soaked parts of Virginia and North Carolina for much of the day, triggering flash flood watches. Overnight, the storm toppled trees in Carthage, North Carolina, a 3-hour drive from the coast. Heavy rain and wind whipped through Charleston, South Carolina, and that's where the storm damaged many homes, including that of 90-year-old Jean Nelson.
I heard this crash, and I thought, what is that? And it sounded like dishes falling.
Further north, Hermine flooded the town of Atlantic Beach, North Carolina, causing at least one major car accident. The storm made landfall in Florida early Friday as a Category 1 hurricane, the first to hit the state since 2005. Storm surges flooded entire neighborhoods, including this one in Tampa, and knocked out power for more than 300,000 people. Florida Governor Rick Scott.
I expect every city and county official to aggressively fix that problem. We have got to get people their power back.
On Skidaway Island in Savannah, Georgia, the storm caused a possible tornado strike that damaged a dozen homes.
It looks like a big mower just came through and mowed down the trees.
As Hermine continues north, the storm is washing out Labor Day weekend plans for many. On the Jersey Shore today, beachgoers had to bundle up.
Covered in blankets, towels, sweatshirt, anything you can get that'll actually stay.
Hermine is expected to linger off the coast of New Jersey for several days, potentially causing worse erosion than during Superstorm Sandy 4 years ago. And DeMarco, New Yorkers have been banned from swimming at city beaches. The most dangerous riptides seen in a century are possible.
Mark Strassman, thank you.
With Hermine heading up the east coast of the U.S., we take a closer look at the science and frequency of these hurricanes. William Brangham is back with more.
Hurricane Hermine is the first major hurricane to hit the United States in 10 years. Sandy, which did tremendous damage in 2012, wasn't a hurricane when it came ashore. So why such a long period of time since the last major hurricane? To help answer that, I'm joined by Sean Sublette. He's a meteorologist with the research group Climate Central. So Sean, just take on this question. Not that anyone is really complaining about this, but why have we gone 10 years since the last major storm hit this U.S.?
We really have been lucky at this point. Weather patterns change from year to year, and the Atlantic Basin has been active over the past decade or so, but the steering winds at any given time have largely directed the major hurricanes away from the continental United States. Now, to remember, a major hurricane, by definition, is a Category 3 or greater storm, a 3, 4, or 5. Hermine was a Category 1 storm, and like Sandy, certainly doing a lot of flood damage, but did not really attain what we technically define as a major hurricane.
One of the things I know is that a lot of the climate models initially had predicted that if the temperature globally goes up, which it has, and oceans had got warmer, which they also have, that we would see more of these storms and a greater frequency of this storm. So are these models somehow contradicted by this last decade?
Not necessarily. I think what most of them have begun to indicate, really, if you go back to the most recent IPCC analysis or the consolidation of the research, is that they're not necessarily going to become more frequent, but there is going to be the tendency, or at least likelihood, that the ones that do form are going to have more intense rain and very likely stronger winds, so that the ones that do manage to develop will likely be stronger. And the fact that sea level has continued to rise as a lot of the polar regions have seen the glacial ice melt, that will compound any kind of storm surge flooding that comes from hurricanes.
So this last 10 years and the models that you're describing, they don't really help us understand what the next 10 years could look like for the U.S.
Yeah, for the very short term, there is not an awful lot of skill with those particular batches of climate models. The shorter term is really kind of that area that most of the work needs to be done. But we do look for the longer term trends when we think about climate change, as climate is a much longer term phenomenon on the order of decades to a century versus so much several years to a decade.
So let's go back to Hermine, which is now threatening the Atlantic seaboard. We've got something like 30 million people up and down the coast that might be looking at some glimpse of this storm. What are we likely to see this weekend and into next week?
What we're really concerned about going forward into tomorrow, as the center of storm goes up the southeastern coast, affects Hampton Roads, Virginia, and then, as we alluded to earlier on in the broadcast, going off the New Jersey or Delmarva Peninsula and likely just stalling for 2 or 3 days. And it may attain hurricane status once again, but really the biggest story is going to be the tremendous coastal flooding, as if this system just hangs off the New Jersey or Delmarva Peninsulas and spins for 2 or 3 days, you'll have a broad area of winds coming onshore that will likely lead to some serious coastal flooding.
So why is the stalling important? I mean, I take it you're saying we would prefer it to just rush through more quickly?
Absolutely. I mean, most of the time, once these systems push northward, they begin to accelerate back out to sea. The steering winds, however, with this particular system look like they're going to set up so that it's going to stall once it clears off the Virginia Capes and just offshore, only about 100 miles or so. So if it just sits and spins in that counterclockwise direction, you have a continuous fetch of water onto shore from those strong northeasterly winds, and that's what's going to pile up the water along the coast.
All right, Sean Sublette from Climate Central, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Kim Brown in Baltimore. It's official. The Earth has entered the Anthropocene epoch. That's a new geological era defined by human impact. This, according to an expert group of scientists assembled at the International Geological Congress in Cape Town, South Africa this week. July 2016 was the warmest July in 136 years of modern record keeping, according to a monthly analysis of global temperatures by the scientists at the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies. This week, in an interview with the Guardian newspaper, Gavin Schmidt, who's the director of the Institute, said, quote, "It's unprecedented in 1,000 years. There's no period that has the trend seen in the 20th century in terms of the inclination of temperatures," end quote. While droughts and wildfires and floods rage all around the world, including across the U.S., Hawaii's Big Island just dodged a bullet with Hurricane Madeline as it weakened to a tropical storm as it passed through, although forecasters warn that Hurricane Lester is not far behind. Hurricane Hermine made landfall in Florida early Friday, bringing with it torrential rains and strong winds, knocking out power to over 200,000 residents and possibly causing the death of at least one person. Hermine has been downgraded to a tropical storm and will move its way up the East Coast over the weekend. It was the first time in recorded history that 3 tropical storm systems threatened the U.S. simultaneously. If Lester makes landfall on the Big Island as a hurricane, it would be the first since record keeping began. Now, with us to discuss extreme weather and the link to climate change is Dr. Michael E. Mann. Michael is the Distinguished Professor and Director of the Earth System Science Center at Penn State University. He's also author of the new book titled Madhouse Effect. Michael, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks. It's good to be with you.
Michael, we had you on just recently to discuss the flooding in Louisiana, and now we have these hurricanes and tropical storms causing more damage and potentially an unprecedented hurricane in terms of historical records that may hit Hawaii. Can you talk about this in relation to climate change and if this could be seen as part of a pattern?
Yeah, so one of the things that we know is that climate change is warming up the oceans, and all other things being equal, warmer oceans means more evaporation of that very warm water into the atmosphere, more moisture, and it's the moisture and the lifting of that moisture that is what powers a hurricane, a tropical storm. And so as we warm up the earth, as we warm up the ocean surface, we provide more energy to strengthen, to create and strengthen these storms, tropical cyclones, hurricanes, typhoons. Different manifestations of the same thing, a tropical storm. So whether or not we will see more hurricanes or fewer hurricanes is still up for debate because that depends on a variety of factors. But the things that we're pretty confident about are that we will see more intense hurricanes and that those hurricanes will yield more of those soaking rains that we're seeing right now, for example, with Hermione. Warmer atmosphere, more moisture in the air means the potential for more rainfall. And so we expect to see heavier flooding associated with these tropical storms, the sort of flooding that we're seeing right now with Hermione. So the bottom line is more intense and damaging hurricanes and more damage from flooding associated with even larger amounts of rainfall. It isn't coincidental that over the last year we have seen the strongest hurricane or typhoon on record in both the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere. We are seeing climate change impacting these storms in terms of their intensity and in terms of the flooding damage that they're doing.
Your associate, Gavin Schmidt, who is the lead scientist at the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies, he said this week in an interview with The Guardian that, again, it's unprecedented in 1,000 years what we've been seeing in terms of temperatures. But he also went on to say that maintaining temperatures below the 1.5-degree guardrail requires significant and very rapid cuts in carbon dioxide emissions, and that is very unlikely to be a thing, that we are not even making emissions cuts commensurate with keeping warming below the 2-degree mark. Do you agree with those statements?
The first part of it is correct. In fact, his statement that the warming that we're seeing is unprecedented in at least 1,000 years, ironically, that conclusion is based on the so-called hockey stick curve that my co-authors and I published back in the late 1990s. And we demonstrated with that publication that the warming that we've seen over the last few decades is outside the range of anything we see for at least the past 1,000 years. So that conclusion actually dates back a decade and a half now. And it provides context for understanding the onslaught of record-breaking years we're seeing. 2014 was the warmest year on record, but then it was beat out by 2015, and now 2016 looks poised to beat out 2015. That would be 3 record-breaking years in a row. And that warmth has this larger context where we haven't seen anything like that in at least 1,000 years. Now, in terms of keeping warming below certain thresholds, the threshold that's most widely discussed is the 2 degrees Celsius, 3.5 degree Fahrenheit threshold. That is the level of warming where we anticipate the worst impacts of climate change and the greatest potential for irreversible climate change impacts. Some regions, low-lying island nations, rightly point out that with even less warming, they are likely to be destroyed. We will see the disappearance of low-lying island nations because of the sea level rise associated with even less warming. And that's where the 1.5 degrees Celsius target comes in. Many of the representatives from these low-lying island nations and elsewhere have articulated the case for not a 2-degree Celsius warming limit, but an even lower 1.5 degrees Celsius warming limit. Now, that indeed will be a challenge. In order to avoid that amount of warming, we do have to rapidly ramp down our carbon emissions in the years ahead. Where I disagree with my good friend Gavin Schmidt is that it is wrong to conclude that that's impossible. That's really an assessment of willpower rather than of science. The science tells us that we can still avoid crossing that threshold. It will require a major effort on our part. But if you look at what's going on right now, there are reasons for cautious optimism. We actually saw carbon emissions come to a peak 2 years ago and slightly decline for the first time in decades last year. That suggests that the efforts that are already afoot to transition away from burning of fossil fuels towards renewable energy, that those efforts among the various nations of the world are paying dividends. We are already seeing that effort in the numbers that are coming in. Those numbers are telling us we're starting to turn the corner. We need to turn the corner even faster. And there was a historic agreement reached earlier this year in Paris, actually last year, December 2015 in Paris, where nearly 200 nations from around the world, including the world's largest emitters, us, China, and many of the other major emitters, all agreed to lower their carbon emissions in the decades ahead by an amount that will actually get us halfway to where we need to be. So it won't solve the problem, but it actually, if those nations make good on their commitments, it'll get us halfway from where we would otherwise be, business as usual, warming of 4 to 5 degrees Celsius, 7 to 9 degrees Fahrenheit warming of the planet by the end of the century. It'll get us halfway down to where we need to be, less than 2 degrees Celsius, 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit. What that says is that we're making real progress. We have to try even harder. We have to turn the corner even faster. And that's what many of us hope we will see in the years ahead. We'll see even more stringent commitments from the nations of the world as we seek to combat this, threat, this existential, unprecedented threat.
Michael, we hear a lot about reducing carbon emissions. One thing we hear less about, but starting to hear more about, is that of methane gas emissions, because as you know, that the United States, Canada, and other nations around the world participate in the energy extraction as known as hydraulic fracturing or fracking in order to extract gas and crude oil out of shale. And the process is known to release tremendous amounts of methane gas. How does the methane figure into what we're trying to do in terms of reduce emissions on the carbon side? But are we maybe not even, are we canceling those gains out by engaging with this methane release?
Yeah, so that's a real concern. Natural gas is arguably a less carbon-intensive source of fuel than coal, for example. And so there are those who have argued that if we can get off coal, at least, and replace that in part with the burning of natural gas, that could help us get on that pathway that we need to get on to lower our carbon emissions. One of the problems there is what you note. Some of that natural gas, which is mostly methane, actually escapes into the atmosphere during the process of natural gas extraction, during fracking, hydraulic fracturing. And methane is actually a very potent greenhouse gas, even more potent than CO2. So if enough of that methane escapes into the atmosphere, it could easily offset any nominal advantage that natural gas might seem to have over coal when you look at the CO2 emissions associated with the two sources. So what it really underscores is the fact that we have to get off fossil fuels, full stop. And natural gas is a fossil fuel just like petroleum, oil, just like coal. If we are to, again, stabilize the climate below those dangerous levels of warming, we really have to get off fossil fuels entirely. And that means leaving most of the natural gas, most of the oil, and just about all of the coal in the ground. We can't continue to extract and burn those fossil fuels if we are going to keep warming below that dangerous threshold.
So some climate deniers are still saying that this warming trend is part of a natural pattern. How do we know that it isn't?
Yeah, there's so many different ways we know that that it can't be natural, that we could spend a whole hour talking about it. But the simplest point to make here is that we are seeing warming now, a rate of warming that, as we discussed earlier, is unprecedented, potentially in thousands of years. And we know that when we take climate models and we drive them just with the natural factors, guess what? The climate models actually want to cool over the last half century. Natural factors like volcanoes and a decrease in solar output have actually been pushing the climate in the opposite direction. So not only can't they explain the warming we've seen, they haven't even been pushing us in that direction. We have offset any small natural cooling that might have arisen from those natural factors, and all of the warming that we've seen is due to human impact.
G20 leaders are meeting in China this week, and three of the world's biggest multinational insurers, Aviva, Aegon, and Amlin, they're calling on them to implement a time frame to end the subsidies for fossil fuel companies. Do you think we've entered an era where the cost is becoming clearer and the risks are outweighing the benefits of a fossil fuel-based economy?
Yeah, absolutely. Very well put. The bottom line is that there is this damage that is done to our planet, to our economy, to us, to our health, to our food, to water, to ecosystems, everything you can imagine. There's this damage that is being done by the burning of fossil fuels and the climate change it's causing and the acidification of the oceans that it's causing. And the problem has been that up to now, there has been no market signal that reflects that damage. Nobody pays for that pollution. You can pollute our atmosphere for free and do all the damage that comes with it. That has to change. We need to put a price on the emission of carbon so that we do indeed level the playing field, so that renewable energy can fairly compete against fossil fuel energy. And so not only should we not be providing incentives in the form of subsidies to the fossil fuel industry, we need to be providing disincentives. We need to put a price on the burning of carbon, and we need to incentivize clean energy so that we can, as I said earlier, turn the corner towards a fossil fuel-free economy even faster, fast enough to avoid truly catastrophic changes in our climate.
And lastly, Michael, I mean, realistically, what is the time frame for that? Do you think that enough of the Earth's countries, especially the biggest polluters, do you think we can all get on the same page? I mean, the Paris Accords notwithstanding, you know, it's one thing to sign something. It's a whole another thing to actually put it into practice. I mean, are we 20 years away from this? 50, 100? Do we get some sort of outlier here? Like, how far away do you think we are from this?
Yeah, I'm actually pretty optimistic about this, and I'll tell you why. The largest emitter of carbon on the planet right now is China. It's no longer the United States. And China and the U.S. reached this bilateral agreement a year ago to lower their carbon emissions, and then they both were signatories, of course, to the Paris Accord. Here's the thing. China is actually decommissioning coal-fired power plants now. They are investing far more on wind and solar energy than anybody else in the world. And so here we have the world's largest emitter having recognized we've got to stop this way of doing business. And China now is moving dramatically in the direction of renewable energy to the extent that they've flooded the global marketplace with cheap solar panel technology, and that's making it much easier for other countries to build their renewable energy economy. So we're seeing immense progress being made. We're seeing the world's largest emitter actually move dramatically away from the burning of fossil fuels. Now, obviously, we here in the U.S. have to keep up our end of the deal, the commitment that we have made to China and to the rest of the world in Paris. And what we obviously will need is a president who will continue the policies of the current administration and continue to work to address the issue of climate change rather than deny that the problem even exists. We face a very stark choice in this next election between a candidate, the Democratic candidate, who will continue the policies of the current administration and help and make sure that the U.S. helps lead in the effort to migrate away from a fossil fuel economy, versus the Republican candidate, Donald Trump, who dismisses climate change as a hoax. The stakes couldn't be greater in this next election.
We've been joined with Michael E. Mann. He is a doctor. Michael is the distinguished professor and the director of the Earth System and Science Center at Penn State University. He's also author of the new book, The Madhouse Effect. Michael, I know the Madhouse Effect has some wonderful illustrations. Can you shout out your co-illustrator of the book?
Absolutely. Tom Tolles is the Washington Post's editorial cartoonist. Many of your viewers will be familiar with his square cartoons that appear in the Washington Post and all over the place every day. And there's always that little guy down in the corner, and you have to read what he's saying. That little guy is actually Tom himself, drawing himself, and he always has some very clever commentary. Well, Tom has probably done the hardest hitting editorial commentary about climate change in our entire media over the last decade in the form of his hard-hitting cartoons in the Washington Post. And it was a real honor to be able to work with him to use that to write a book that tries to approach this problem from a different direction, that uses satire and ridicule and exposing hypocrisy, but a lot of humor in talking about the issue of climate change and what we need to do to combat this problem, to prevail in combating this problem.
The Madhouse Effect. It is in bookstores. You should go pick it up. Dr. Mann, we certainly appreciate your time as always. Thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.